Just swapped it around. Well, I'm here as the old, unreconstructed old left, but I do use Twitter a lot. So, but no, I don't. I mean, it's interesting in terms of the old left. I'm obviously a socialist, and calling something the old left is a very easy way of writing something out as out of date, not modern, if you like. But socialism, of course, changes. It changes as the system we're fighting against changes, and it's changed a huge amount. And it is tragic, actually, that I'm following it, because I am going to put a bit of a down on in terms of what I think with the situation we're in. Because I think it's interesting, the power of nightmares, if you like, the way you undermine them is by understanding what they are. And the truth is, the left, despite the biggest, most catastrophic crisis of capitalism since the 1930s, in my view, no longer doesn't currently exist as a mass political force. And that's true the world over, with the exception of Latin America, I'd argue. And the reason we got into this situation is a perfect storm which enveloped the left from the late 70s onwards. Firstly, the rise of the new right, spearheaded by Thatcherism and Reaganism. And it's interesting, if we look at previous crises of capitalism, the 30s and the 70s, because it was the right that emerged victorious in those crises. And the 30s, fascism enveloped Europe, and Britain was subject to majority conservative governments throughout the 1930s. In the 1970s, it was interesting because both right and left did radicalise to a degree. You had a radicalisation on the left. It's interesting, Peter Oborne, quite a thoughtful right-wing columnist in the Telegraph, said this recently. He said it wasn't sure which one would have the upper hand. But of course, Thatcherism and Reaganism crushed all before them in the 1980s. You had the smashing of the labour movement, the backbone of the left. So starting, for example, with the steelworkers, I grew up in Stockport Express, which was brave struggle in the early 80s. They were beaten in fields, which, looking around, a few of you might remember. Looking at you, Stuart, actually. And then you had, of course, the miners' strike, the Great Miners' Strike. And that was a decisive turning point in the labour movement. The miners were the vanguard of the trade union movement in this country. The 1926 general strike was held in solidarity with the miners. The miners took down Ted Heath's government in the early 70s, and the Tories did not forget that, and it was part of the reason they so ruthlessly took on the miners with the determination that they did. And of course, with the defeat of the miners and Wapping, that's when you've got this huge rightward shift in the labour movement cemented, New Realism, as it was called, which was basically class collaborationism of the union leaders basically arguing that the position was so weak that the union leadership has no choice but to enter into partnership deals with management. So that, these defeats, these repeated defeats, along with mass unemployment, which helped more than anything else, more than the anti-union laws, break the power of the labour movement in this country in the 1980s. Neoliberal globalisation, which hemmed in, supposedly, this idea that national governments could introduce what were regarded as traditional social democratic policies. And above all, the ideological consequences of the collapse of Stalinism. And as much as all of us, I hope, in this room abhor everything Soviet totalitarianism stood for, that was manipulated by the right to argue that all alternatives, not just to capitalism actually, but to untrammelled capitalism, were now obsolete. Francis Fukuyama, an unfortunate name, wrote The End of History, which summed up that triumphalist move. Midge Depter, another neocon in America, she said, "It's time to say we've won. Goodbye." And again, that summed up that triumphalism. And across the world, both here, you got that obviously dramatic shift to the right of the Labour Party. That wasn't unique to Britain. Across the entire world, there was an almost synchronised shift right by all parties on the left. The big mass communist parties, the social democratic parties, national liberation movements in Africa, like the ANC, which was previously committed to widespread nationalisation, but when it came to power in 1994, ended up introducing neoliberal policies. Now, unless we understand that, what happened, then I don't think we can understand how we actually rebuild the left from that, if you like, that perfect storm which enveloped the global left. And that's why I think what's interesting about today is that we now live in an age of revolt. There's no questioning that. That the consequences of neoliberalism have triggered these massive revolts of different nature. A struggle against the brutal Western-backed dictatorship is different than the struggles we've seen in this country, but they're part of the same age of revolt, if you like. But it's an age of revolt without a coherent left, which in a previous era could have taken the leadership of those movements and directed it, I think, in a way which could have taken on capitalism. And I think in this, for example, we say the student movement, autonomism has filled that vacuum to a large degree. Because there wasn't a coherent left to give leadership to those movements, it was autonomism that filled the vacuum. It's a symptom, just another symptom of the weakness of what was regarded as the traditional organised left. And I think it's reminiscent in some ways, partly of the 60s and 70s American New Left. Now they argued the working class had lost its revolutionary potential, and they looked for other groups, students being one, oppressed ethnic minorities, of course African Americans in particular, the urban poor. One of the great New Left political scientists, C. Wright Mills, attacked the so-called labour metaphysic. Now, I think today, you can see echoes of that. But the difference is, I suppose, that lack of even a possible coherent left as you did have in the 60s and 70s, when you really did have an old left and a new left battling for supremacy. But I don't think you do at the moment. I think you have autonomism filling that vacuum, and as inspiring as these great movements like Occupy Wall Street and Occupy the London Stock Exchange are, they've shown they're useful, above all because they refocus the debate on who caused the crisis. There's still, when you go to these movements, when you go to them, there's still a lack of a coherent programme for people to unite around. There's a common anger and a common frustration, but the coherent alternative isn't there as things stand, even though it's useful in reframing that debate. Now, in terms of how we go about actually rebuilding ourselves as a mass political force, because that's the task ahead of us, in my view, it has to be entirely class-based. Class politics and the left, in my view, are synonymous. Without an understanding of class, we're radical liberals, effectively. That's what makes socialism. Now, the key question, in my view, facing Britain today and the world is the political representation of the working class. But of course, when we say that, we have to recognise that the working class has changed. That it's still the same. I'm sure all of us here have an orthodox view of what the working class is, those who have to sell their labour to live. But what we had was the industrial working class, which was, for example, in 1979, over 7 million people worked in manufacturing. Today it's just over 2.5 million. And instead you've got the shift to a service sector-based working class. So, for example, there were 1 million call centre workers. That's as many as there were miners at the peak of the mining industry. The second biggest employer in the country is retail. So, for example, supermarkets. The number of people working in supermarkets has trebled since 1980. And what's different, partly they're not actually as backbreaking or dirty as jobs, but at the same time, they're far more insecure. There's a much bigger turnover of staff. You don't have, in the same way, jobs pass from generation to generation. You don't have communities based around supermarkets and call centres in the way you once did around steelworks, mines, docks, and so on. Levels of unionisation are far lower. So now, because of the attacks on the labour movement, whilst over half of public sector workers are unionised, in the private sector it's 14%, it's just gone down a percentage point, and most of those are formerly public sector workers who've been contracted out. In supermarkets, unionisation has levelled at about 8 to 10%, and it's not changed in about 3 decades. So the absolute Usdaw, I think, a completely useless union leadership, can boast that their union membership has expanded, but that's simply because the number of supermarket workers has exploded. They haven't expanded as a percentage at all. So you have this change, if you like. Other changes too. For example, in the service sector, you have the concentration of women, particularly in insecure and low-paid work, for example. That expansion of female workforce. But that is what the left has to come to grips with. Now, part of that in terms of the labour movement, in the 1880s, the big question facing the trade union movement was the fact that before then, trade unions were concentrated amongst skilled craft workers. And new unionism, as the movement was called, was about expanding it to unskilled workers. Today we need a new unionism which is focused on the service sector in particular. Now that means a check, because it's not easy to organise when you have, for example, 1.5 million temporary workers who don't have the same rights and conditions as everyone else. When you have 1.3 part-time workers who want to be in full-time work but can't get that. When you have such a turnover of staff, all of those things make it far more difficult to unionise. But they said back then, it was interesting in the 30s when you had the expansion, for example, of car factories, particularly in the Midlands, and it was said then that it would be impossible to organise car factory workers, that the nature of car factory work was impossible. Well, of course, they became amongst the most militant sections of the British labour movement in the 1960s and 1970s. So it can be done, but it's not easy, but it needs a complete revolution within the British labour movement to actually do that. Now, in terms of political representation, and this is where we're all not going to agree. Now, I should explain, I'm from the Labour left. I worked for John McDonnell for a number of years. I ran both his hugely successful leadership campaigns, which I think changed the very nature of the British left. Alright, stop here, laughing. However, this is my take on it. All attempts to split from the Labour Party have failed in over 106 years of its existence now. The SDF, the Social Democratic Federation, the Independent Labour Party, my great-uncle played on their football team in the 1930s. It was a very big, integral part of my family history, if you like. It split from the Labour Party in the 1930s during an economic crisis, and when it left, it dwindled into complete insignificance. The militant, now again, my dad, I should explain again, was a militant full-timer for several years. They left en masse and became the Socialist Party. I don't know if there's any Socialist Party comrades in the room. I'm speaking at socialism, but no offence to them, but their influence as well dramatically contracted, and I think now they're often one of the most difficult groups on the left to talk to. Lots of knowing laughs, good to hear. Shall I mention the Socialist Labour Party, or should I just leave that one? Yeah. But that's my point. So that is that from my perspective, it's not some sort of nostalgia about Labourism, it's not some sort of bizarre, deep-rooted affection. It's a pragmatic assessment that because the trade union movement, the biggest part of the trade union movement, remains affiliated to the Labour Party, that provides the potential, at least, for it to be a political voice for the working class. And the problem we have is that the unions do not use the potential power that they have within the Labour Party, which is hugely sizable. They don't use that properly to fight for the policies that we all want. Now, if we can't get them to do that, I don't see how we can get them to make the extra leap to creating an entirely new party altogether. And I think the unions would have to be absolutely central to any new party. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, I'm glad nationalisation came up, talking about a new model of social ownership. Now, the nationalisation we're all familiar with was invented by Peter Mandelson's granddad, Herbert Morrison, and it was a top-down bureaucratic version of the public corporation, if you like, where the workers involved in those industries have no real say. And I think what we should be arguing for is democratic social ownership. And the RNT, for example, have proposed, if we were to take the railways into public ownership, that you'd have an elected management board, a third for the workers, a third for passengers, and a third for the government. So you could still plan overall for the overall economy, which I think for socialists is important, but you'd have workers' democracy and also people who actually use the railways. And I think that's a model you can apply to the energy companies and so on. Democratic social ownership, which you could then integrate and use to plan and overcome the anarchy and irrationality of capitalism. So I think those are the things we can talk about, if you like. But for me, I think there's great potential now, there's huge disillusionment with capitalism as things stand. But without any attempt to give political representation around a coherent political programme, my fear is that will fizzle out, because the anti-capitalism movement in the early noughties, which again I marched with, what happened to that? There was no coherent programme and it fizzled out. So that's what we need to fight for, and that's the message, I think, whatever our differences over things like Labour, we have to bring to these emerging movements. Thank you. Just very quickly, firstly, Comrade pointed out often, the comment from Lambeth Unison actually, in terms of how the left doesn't relate to its policies to the everyday experiences of working people. I think it's such a key point. We need to relate to people on bread and butter issues. the fact there are 5 million people in this country languishing on social housing waiting lists, for example. Those issues which the left so often doesn't respond to, doesn't provide answers to, which relate to people's experiences. I wasn't trying to do down the Occupy movements. I think they're great and very inspiring in lots of ways. They remind who caused the crisis, because the Tories and the right-wing media have changed the crisis caused by the banks into a crisis of public spending. This is an attempt to shift that debate back and make clear who was actually waging war, which is the people at the top. They're waging class war, and obviously that has to be answered. Now that is part of that process and is useful. The point I think there is unity on this is having a coherent alternative for people to unite around. Because I was part of the anti-globalisation movement. I was kettled in Manchester in 2001, and there wasn't a lack of anger and determination in the anti-globalisation movement. Thousands of activists chased the world's rulers from city to city, from summit to summit. But without a coherent alternative to actually organise and unite around, it was swept away by the jingoism that followed 9/11. Now that helped in terms of the basis from creating the anti-war movement, but in terms of creating an alternative to capitalist society, I don't think that happened. And I think actually the sectarianism we've discussed is a symptom. Al Richardson, a socialist who died many years ago, he wrote an article called The Joy of Sects. Funny man. But he pointed out that a period of when the class struggle was at a low ebb, the sects strode the stage of history like giants. And I think that's true. Sectarianism is just a symptom of a lack of rooting in the labour movement, in my view. And I think the crisis of leadership we have, all I'd argue with that is it's not as though there's millions of people unfortunately straining at the leash as things stand for a coherent alternative to capitalism who are being stopped by a conservative leadership. That's not true. We need to build rank and file pressure. But at the moment, the fear at the top of Unite, for example, the bureaucrats, if you like, is that they're not going to get a high enough turnout, even if they win on the ballot. That's their desperation to drag members with them. That doesn't often sit easy with our analysis of the conservative nature of the bureaucracy. And finally, in terms of Bolshevism, well, I think the problem there, I suppose, is what I never understood, even just taken from a revolutionary socialist perspective, is what the relevance of adapting a strategy and set of a strategy, if you like, that was born out of Tsarist oppression over 100 years ago, or 100 years ago, in a semi-feudal country where 90% of the population were peasants. In the same way, I think we look at that revolution as part of the traditions of the labour movement, as the Paris Commune was. You don't go back, this harking back to that as the strategy, in my view, just wrong-headed. You have to adapt your strategy to the realities that we face today and how capitalism has dramatically changed, and how class has dramatically changed. That is where the new left, any new left will be born, in my view.